Have you ever been laughed at for something small, something you thought was harmless, only to later realize that those very moments shaped your future? What if the same laughter that made you feel small became the very thing that pushed you to reach greater heights? This is the story of Ethan, a young man who, after being ridiculed for ordering a cheap bottle of wine, ended up buying the vineyard where that wine came from. It sounds unbelievable, right? But sometimes the biggest successes come from moments where we feel most embarrassed. It all started on a quiet evening at a high-end restaurant, the kind of place where every detail screams luxury. The gold trim on the walls, the sparkling crystal glasses, and the polished marble floors, it was a world far removed from Ethan's everyday life. Ethan, just out of college, was trying his best to blend in with a group of well-dressed, wealthy individuals. He was eager to make a good impression, even though he was far from comfortable in such an upscale environment. Everyone at the table seemed so at ease, so sophisticated, while Ethan felt like he was the odd one out. When the waiter came around asking for wine orders, Ethan had no idea what he was doing. He wasn't exactly a wine connoisseur, but he knew enough to understand that wine in these places wasn't cheap. It was an unwritten rule that you didn't order the cheapest thing on the menu, especially in front of people who had clearly made a life of enjoying luxury. The others at the table had already chosen their selections with the confidence that only wealth could bring, and Ethan, feeling the weight of their eyes on him, started to sweat. He didn't want to look foolish, but he also didn't want to overstep. After a moment of hesitation, he made the decision to pick the least expensive wine on the menu. As soon as the words left his mouth, the room fell silent for a second before the laughter started. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like a small but noticeable crack in the glass of the evening's calm. The others around the table, clearly used to fine wine, exchanged amused glances, their faces filled with judgment. One of them, a woman in her 30s who seemed to have everything together, raised an eyebrow and softly chuckled. "Really? That's your choice?" It wasn't a cruel laugh, but it was enough to make Ethan feel small. His face flushed and his stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't just embarrassed. He felt like he had made a fool of himself. The laughter wasn't mocking, but the judgment was unmistakable. And to Ethan that was almost worse. "Who orders the cheapest wine in a place like this?" he thought, wishing the earth would swallow him whole. He tried to laugh it off, but inside he was crushed. All around him people were sipping from their extravagant glasses, discussing their favorite vineyards, their preferred wines. Meanwhile, he sat there with his bottle of cheap red, feeling like an outsider in a room full of insiders. The conversation continued, but Ethan couldn't focus on the words. His mind was racing, replaying the moment over and over. "I don't belong here," he thought. "I'll never fit in with these people." The realization stung, but it also sparked something inside him. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, Ethan began to question everything he thought he knew about success and status. Was this how things were going to be for him forever? Was he always going to be the guy who couldn't afford the good stuff, the one who was laughed at because of his choices? Then, in that very moment, something clicked. Maybe he didn't need to fit in. Maybe the people laughing at him weren't the ones he should be measuring himself against. Maybe the world wasn't about having the best wine or the flashiest possessions, but about having the vision and the drive to create something of your own, to carve out a space where your choices, no matter how small, meant something. It was in the midst of his humiliation that the seed for something much bigger began to grow. Ethan didn't let the laughter crush him. It fueled him. He could have let it break him, could have let the judgment sink him into self-doubt, but instead, he felt a surge of determination. "I'll show them," he thought. "Not by fitting in with their world, but by creating a world of my own." What started as a simple desire to fit in turned into something far greater. It wasn't about wine or wealth. It was about ambition. It was about proving that a moment of mockery could be transformed into the motivation for an extraordinary journey. As the night went on, Ethan drank his cheap wine, but his mind was elsewhere. The laughter, once so painful, had planted a new idea in his head. He had no idea where that idea would take him, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. Instead, it would be the spark that set him on the path to something far greater than he ever imagined. The world hadn't seen the last of Ethan. The evening ended, but the sting of laughter lingered in Ethan's mind long after he left the restaurant. The mockery he had faced was no longer just about that cheap bottle of wine. It became a symbol of something bigger, something he hadn't fully realized yet. Ethan, walking home under the dim streetlights, felt a strange sense of clarity. "Why not me?" he thought. "Why can't I be someone who can walk into a room like that and own it?" He wasn't going to let himself be defined by that one moment, nor was he going to let his past decisions, no matter how small, keep him from aiming higher. The wine was just a stepping stone. The real question now was, what was his next move? What could he do to not only silence the laughter, but to show the world that he could build something truly remarkable? The answer didn't come to him all at once, but it slowly began to form over the next few weeks. Ethan found himself fascinated by the world of wine. He started reading everything he could find, from books on the history of winemaking to documentaries on famous vineyards. It wasn't just about drinking wine anymore. It was about understanding the craftsmanship behind it. Ethan started to see wine as more than just a drink. It was a story in every bottle. The soil, the climate, the hands that nurtured the grapes, it was all part of something much bigger than he had ever realized. He couldn't shake the thought of owning a vineyard. The idea seemed crazy at first, almost laughable. A young man with no experience in agriculture or the wine industry dreaming of owning a vineyard. It felt like a joke. But the more Ethan thought about it, the more it made sense. If people could mock him for ordering cheap wine, then maybe he could change the narrative by becoming a part of that world, not just as an outsider, but as a creator, a leader. There was a fire growing in him. The very thing that had humiliated him became the fuel for his ambition. He started asking himself the important questions. What does it take to own a vineyard? How do I even get started? He spent hours online, researching everything from grape varieties to soil conditions. He learned about the different climates required for various types of wine, and discovered that owning a vineyard wasn't just about making wine. It was about passion, patience, and knowledge. But most importantly, it was about having a vision. Ethan didn't have a clear path, but the more he learned, the more the dream started to feel real. This wasn't just about having money or status, it was about creating something that could outlast him. A legacy. His own brand of wine, one that would reflect who he was, humble, resilient, and unafraid to take risks. He made a decision. Ethan was going to make his dream of owning a vineyard a reality. And even though he didn't have the resources, the experience, or the connections, he knew he couldn't let that stop him. After all, it wasn't his lack of wealth that had stopped him before. It was his willingness to learn, to grow, and to embrace challenges head-on. Ethan started saving every penny he could. He picked up side jobs, working in everything from restaurants to local farms. Every dollar he earned, every hour he worked, was a step closer to his goal. He didn't care how long it would take. He was in it for the long haul. The ridicule from that night still stung, but now it only reminded him of how far he had come and how much further he was willing to go. In the back of his mind, the image of that expensive restaurant and the mocking faces lingered, but it wasn't painful anymore. It was a reminder of the person he didn't want to be, someone who settled for less. Ethan wasn't going to settle. He wasn't going to let a small moment define his future. Instead, that moment became the spark for a dream that would soon take him farther than he ever thought possible. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ethan worked tirelessly. His journey was just beginning, but he could already feel the momentum building. The dream of owning a vineyard wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was a goal he was willing to fight for, no matter how long it took. It was a path full of uncertainty and challenges, but Ethan was determined. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but that was exactly how he liked it. Every challenge, every setback was just another step closer to making his dream a reality. And in the back of his mind, one thought kept pushing him forward. I'll show them. As the months passed, Ethan's life began to change. The carefree days of university were behind him, and now every decision, every hour of his day was dedicated to his dream. No longer concerned with fitting into high society, he was focused solely on the future he wanted to build. But the road to success wasn't easy, and Ethan quickly learned that pursuing a dream, especially one as ambitious as owning a vineyard, meant sacrificing much of his free time and energy. He picked up every job he could find. He worked late nights as a waiter in a busy restaurant, sometimes picking up extra shifts just to make enough money. In the mornings he worked as a barista at a local coffee shop, barely getting enough rest to recharge before jumping into the next day's responsibilities. Every dollar he earned went straight into his savings, and every minute of his day was accounted for. But it wasn't just about money, it was about learning too. Ethan knew that owning a vineyard wasn't just about writing checks. It was about understanding the land, the process, the people involved. In between shifts, he started visiting local vineyards, even though he couldn't afford to buy anything. He introduced himself to owners, asking if he could help out in any way, even if it was just for a day. Some vineyard owners were kind enough to let him lend a hand, teaching him about grape cultivation, the art of fermentation, and the intricacies of blending wine. Ethan learned quickly. The work was hard and often grueling, but every moment felt worth it. The long hours in the hot sun, the physical labor of picking grapes, the early mornings spent tending to the vines, it was all part of his education. He also spent hours reading books and watching documentaries on the business side of owning a vineyard. Ethan knew that understanding winemaking was only part of the equation. He had to learn about the economics, the marketing, the investment strategies needed to make such an endeavor succeed. There were days when he felt like giving up, when the exhaustion from working multiple jobs left him drained, or when it felt like his savings would never add up. There were nights when he lay awake, wondering if this was all just a dream too big for someone like him. But then he remembered the laughter, the faces of those people mocking him at the restaurant. Their judgment had felt like a weight on his shoulders, but now it was a driving force. He wasn't going to let those memories define him. Instead, he would use them as fuel. I'll prove them wrong, he would tell himself, over and over. At one point, Ethan even tried to secure a loan from a bank, but his lack of financial history and experience made it impossible. The rejection stung, but it wasn't a defeat. It was another obstacle, one that made him more determined. Ethan realized that the path to owning a vineyard wasn't going to be handed to him. He had to fight for every inch, and sometimes that meant taking the hard route. So, instead of letting the rejection discourage him, he doubled down. He started researching alternative ways to fund his dream: grants, crowdfunding, private investors, anything he could do to get the financial backing he needed. Ethan knew that if he wanted to turn his dream into a reality, he would need more than just hard work and ambition. He needed strategy, creativity, and resilience. Through all the hardships, Ethan kept his vision clear. He would own a vineyard, and he would build it from the ground up. He wasn't just trying to be rich or famous, he was determined to create something meaningful, something that represented his journey, his struggle, and his success. The more he learned, the more he realized that a vineyard wasn't just a business, it was a lifestyle. And this lifestyle was one he was ready to commit to, no matter the cost. Each day, as Ethan hustled and worked harder than ever before, he found himself getting closer to his dream. The road wasn't easy, and the struggles were many, but each step brought him closer to the life he had always dreamed of. He had turned the humiliation of that night into the determination to succeed. He had learned the value of patience and persistence, and he was willing to give it everything he had. Ethan didn't know how long it would take or what challenges lay ahead, but he had made a promise to himself. He would not stop until his dream became a reality. After years of hard work and sacrifice, Ethan began to see the fruits of his labor. It wasn't immediate, but with every step forward, he could feel himself getting closer to his dream. The hustle, the long hours, the rejections, they all began to pay off in unexpected ways. Ethan had learned the value of persistence, but more importantly, he had learned how to position himself for success when the right opportunity finally came his way. One rainy afternoon, while working at a local vineyard, Ethan overheard a conversation between the vineyard owner, a middle-aged man named Jack, and a real estate agent. They were discussing the sale of a small but established vineyard on the outskirts of town. Jack, who had been in the business for decades, was ready to retire, and he wanted to pass on the vineyard to someone who could continue its legacy. Ethan's ears perked up. He had no idea what the asking price was, but he felt a spark of hope deep in his chest. He knew this could be the chance he had been waiting for. Over the next few days, Ethan gathered everything he had learned, from the financial knowledge to the practical skills he had honed over the years. He researched the vineyard, learning about its history, its reputation, and the challenges it faced. He reached out to local investors hoping to get some advice and possibly a partnership. He worked late nights perfecting a business plan that included not only the vineyard's operational side but also a strategy to bring in fresh ideas to revitalize the brand. Ethan's vision was clear. This vineyard wouldn't just be about making wine. It would be about creating an experience, one that people could connect with. One that told a story of resilience, ambition, and transformation. Finally, after weeks of preparation, Ethan sat down with Jack and the real estate agent. The meeting was intense, but Ethan remained calm, speaking from the heart about his journey and his vision for the future of the vineyard. Jack, who had been skeptical at first, started to see Ethan's passion and determination. He admired Ethan's drive and his deep understanding of the industry, even though he didn't come from wealth or a long family line of winemakers. Jack could tell that Ethan wasn't just looking to buy a vineyard. He was looking to create something meaningful, to honor the vineyard's history while making it his own. But the biggest hurdle still lay ahead: the money. The price of the vineyard was far beyond Ethan's current means. He didn't have enough savings, and despite his relentless hustle, he still lacked the financial backing he needed. Ethan didn't give up, though. He pulled together every resource he could find: loans, investments from people who believed in him, and even some of the knowledge he had gained from his own research into vineyard management. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he thought it wouldn't happen, but Ethan remained persistent. His belief in his dream was stronger than any obstacle that came his way. A few tense weeks later, Ethan received the call that would change everything. He had done it. He was the proud owner of the vineyard. The celebration wasn't extravagant. There was no champagne or grand party. Instead, Ethan stood in the middle of the vineyard, the sun setting behind the rolling hills of vines, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. This was the culmination of years of hard work, failure, and perseverance. It wasn't just the wine that had gotten him here. It was his relentless belief in the vision, in himself, and in the power of transformation. Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. Buying the vineyard wasn't the end of the journey, it was the start of something even bigger. The real challenge now was taking this vineyard, which had seen its fair share of ups and downs, and turning it into something special. He had the land, the knowledge, and the passion, but he knew the work was only just beginning. He stood there, looking out at the rows of vines, his mind filled with possibilities. He wasn't just going to make wine. He was going to create a brand, a legacy, and an experience that people could connect with. His dream had come true, but Ethan was determined to make it more than just a personal success. It would be a story of triumph, of overcoming doubt, and proving that with hard work, resilience, and a bit of ambition, anything was possible. Ethan's life began to change in ways he could never have imagined. Owning the vineyard was no longer just a dream. It was now his reality. But the journey from the humble, cheap bottle of wine to becoming the owner of a successful vineyard had been anything but easy. There were still challenges to face, and the road ahead was far from smooth. However, with every setback, Ethan became more determined. He wasn't just going to make this work for himself. He was going to make it work for everyone who had ever doubted him. As months passed, Ethan worked tirelessly to transform the vineyard into a thriving business. He spent long hours learning the technical side of winemaking, everything from soil analysis to fermentation techniques. He brought in experts, consulted with wine industry professionals, and traveled to other vineyards to learn the secrets of success. But Ethan was more than just a student of the craft. He was a visionary. He knew that success in the wine business wasn't just about making great wine. It was about building a brand that people could trust and connect with. He wanted the vineyard to stand for something, to be a symbol of perseverance, hard work, and success. Ethan's wines began to gain recognition. His first batch wasn't perfect, but it was good. As the months went on, he fine-tuned his methods, paid attention to the smallest details, and slowly but surely his wines started to earn rave reviews. Local restaurants began to feature his products, and wine enthusiasts from all over started to take notice. What started as a modest venture was now growing into something much bigger. Ethan's Vineyard was no longer just a business. It was becoming a name people recognized, a symbol of determination and vision. Then came the moment that Ethan had been waiting for, the moment when the people who had once laughed at him were finally going to see the success he had built. One evening, Ethan was invited to a high-profile gala in the same restaurant where he had been ridiculed for ordering cheap wine years earlier. The invitation came as a surprise, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He was no longer the same young man who had felt small under the weight of others' judgments. He was a successful vineyard owner, and he wasn't about to let the past dictate his future. The night of the gala, Ethan walked into the restaurant with a quiet confidence. He wasn't there to prove anyone wrong. He was simply there to enjoy the evening and celebrate how far he had come. But as he walked through the room, he couldn't help but notice the familiar faces of the people who had once mocked him. They didn't recognize him at first, not until he walked up to the bar and ordered a glass of wine, his wine. He watched as the bartender poured the wine, his heart racing just a little. When the group of people saw the label, their faces fell. It was his wine. The cheap bottle they had once laughed at had now become something much more. They recognized him, and there was no mocking this time, no laughter, only surprise, admiration, and maybe just a hint of regret. Ethan's moment of vindication wasn't about rubbing his success in their faces. It was about showing them, and more importantly, showing himself, that he had done it. The laughter had only been the beginning. It had been the fuel that pushed him to keep going, to prove that he was capable of achieving something great. And now, standing in the very place where his journey had started, Ethan realized that he had truly come full circle. But there was one final act that closed the chapter in the most poetic way possible. Ethan walked up to the group, holding a bottle of his own wine. With a calm, measured smile, he offered it to them. "I thought you might like to try it," he said. The irony wasn't lost on him, but his voice was calm and sincere. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the journey, about proving that no matter where you start, no matter how small you feel, you can always turn things around. As the evening went on, Ethan didn't dwell on the past. He wasn't there to rub his success in anyone's face. He was there to show that even the smallest moment of mockery could lead to something extraordinary. The young man who had once been laughed at for ordering cheap wine was now the proud owner of a successful vineyard, respected in his field. Ethan didn't need anyone else's approval to validate his success. His journey, his struggles, and his triumphs were enough. The vineyard was more than just a business to him. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome, of the power of persistence and self-belief. He had proven to himself, and to the world, that with enough heart, hustle, and vision, anyone could turn their dreams into reality. And as the night ended, with the laughter of the past now a distant memory, Ethan took one last look at the vineyard that had come to define his life. He wasn't just an owner of land and grapes. He was a living testament to the power of never giving up. The world had laughed at him, but now they were toasting to his success. As Ethan stood in the vineyard at sunset, he let the silence wash over him. The golden light stretched across the fields, casting long shadows over the rows of grapes that now seemed like symbols of his entire journey, from the initial moments of mockery to the painstaking years of hard work and sacrifice. The wind gently rustled the leaves and he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to take it all in. This wasn't just land. This wasn't just a business. This was his dream, manifested in reality. And it had all started with a single, seemingly insignificant choice, the decision to not let a moment of ridicule define him. Looking out over the vineyard, Ethan reflected on everything he had gone through. He thought about the long nights he had spent studying winemaking techniques, the countless jobs he had worked, and the sacrifices he had made along the way. There were times when he doubted himself, when he felt like giving up. There were times when he wondered if he was crazy for believing that a young man from humble beginnings could ever own something as prestigious as a vineyard. But now, standing on this land, with the fruits of his labor all around him, he knew that the struggles had all been worth it. Ethan had learned that success wasn't just about what you achieved, but about who you became along the way. The man who once felt small and out of place in a fancy restaurant, the man who was laughed at for his choice of cheap wine, had transformed into someone who had earned his place in the world, not by fitting in with others, but by carving out his own path. He thought about the faces of the people who had mocked him. At the time, their laughter had been painful, but now it seemed like a distant memory, almost irrelevant. He had turned that moment of mockery into something powerful, a driving force that had propelled him to achieve greatness. It wasn't about getting revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing himself that no matter where you start, no matter how small or insignificant others make you feel, you have the power to change your story. Sometimes, he whispered to himself, it's the things people laugh at that make us strong. It's the challenges, the doubts, the ridicule, they all shape who we are. But it's how we rise above it that matters. Ethan stood there for a while, lost in thought, as the sun dipped below the horizon. The vineyard, with its rows of vines stretching out before him, symbolized more than just a business. It symbolized resilience, transformation, and the unwavering belief that anything is possible. The past wasn't something to regret, it was something to embrace, for it had been the foundation of his success. Without those moments of doubt, without the laughter and the obstacles, he might not have had the fire to keep pushing forward. He wasn't just a vineyard owner. Ethan was a testament to the fact that with enough passion, persistence, and vision, anyone can turn their dreams into reality. He had proven that no matter how ridiculous or impossible a dream might seem, it could be achieved. And now, standing in the quiet of his vineyard, Ethan knew one thing for certain: the journey had been worth every single step. Looking out at the vast, rolling fields, Ethan couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for what he had achieved, but for the lessons he had learned along the way. The most important one being that sometimes the most difficult moments are the ones that teach you the most. The laughter, the setbacks, the failures, they were all just stepping stones on the path to something greater. And so, as the sky turned from orange to deep purple, Ethan made a promise to himself: he would continue to build. He would continue to grow, not just as a business owner, but as a person. His journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And no matter what came next, he would face it with the same determination, passion, and heart that had carried him this far. The world had laughed at him once, but now it was raising a glass to his success. And with that, Ethan smiled, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world. As Ethan stood there, taking in the breathtaking view of his vineyard under the fading light, a deep sense of satisfaction filled him. His journey from a moment of ridicule to owning this beautiful vineyard was complete, but he knew it was far from the end. There were still miles to go, more goals to achieve, and many more stories to create. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Ethan realized something important. His story wasn't just his own. It was a story that could inspire others to rise above their challenges and pursue their dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. So he turned to face the camera, the vineyard behind him now glowing in the soft twilight. He spoke with calm confidence, but there was a warmth in his voice that made his words feel genuine and personal. Everyone has a cheap wine moment, A time when you're laughed at, doubted, or made to feel small. But I want to ask you something. What will you do with that moment? Will you let it define you, or will you use it to fuel your journey? Ethan paused for a moment, allowing the question to settle, before continuing. Success doesn't come easily. It takes patience, it takes hard work, and it takes a belief in yourself even when others doubt you. But I'm here to tell you that no dream is too big. No challenge is too great. If I can turn a simple moment of ridicule into a life-changing journey, so can you. So whatever your dream is, whatever your cheap wine moment looks like, take that first step. Keep pushing, and don't let anyone, not even yourself, stop you. He smiled, a quiet sense of pride in his eyes. I'm just one person, but I believe we all have the power to change our story. To turn our struggles into triumphs, our setbacks into comebacks. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his tone now more personal, more intimate. So I ask you, what's your cheap wine moment? What are you going to do with it? Don't let it be the thing that holds you back. Let it be the thing that propels you forward. And if you've ever doubted that you can achieve something, let this story be your reminder that with enough heart, hard work, and persistence, anything is possible. The camera zoomed out slowly, giving a final panoramic shot of the vineyard, now glowing softly in the cool evening air. If you found this story inspiring, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't let their dreams go unspoken. And remember, no matter where you start, even if it's with something as simple as a cheap bottle of wine, you have the power to write your own story. And the best part is, the next chapter is yours to create. The screen faded to black with a simple message: share your story. Take the first step.